Welcome everyone to today's webinar. My name is Matt Baer, the founder of Q4Launch. Excited that you all are here with us. We're going to give people just a couple more minutes, a few minutes before 2 yet Eastern time. Give people a couple more minutes here to log in, and then we will get our webinar kicked off promptly at 2. Welcome everyone again to today's webinar. My name is Matt Baer, the founder of Q4Launch. Excited that you are along for the ride with us today as we dive into an introduction to yield management, which was our starting title we started out with. And then as we were producing the content, I just thought it'd be a lot more fun if we made the title How to Make More Money and Work Less. After all, that's the name of the game. And isn't that the American dream, I think, somewhere? You know, big house on the hill, make more money, work less. Well, today we're going to dive into that subject a little bit and really take a look at yield management or revenue management and hopefully get some of your questions answered on that today. If this is your first time with us, glad that you are here, glad you're along for the ride, and look forward to connecting with you over about the next 45 to 60 minutes and sharing some insights that we have developed from being in the travel marketing world for years and a lot of the things we help our customers with. So we're going to tell you some of that, tell you our experiences there, and share some of those stories with you as we move throughout our time together today. Little brief bio on myself and our company if this is your first time with us. I started Q4Launch about 8 years ago now after spending 7 years before that running an e-commerce company where I developed my own line of products and quickly realized that e-commerce was really just a marketing game and had to learn internet marketing. And through the 7 years of doing that, as social media was evolving and everything else, learned a ton and used a lot of principles that we now call content marketing. Back then we didn't have fancy names for them, but we used a lot of those principles to drive success in our e-commerce company. And then about 8 years ago, sold that, took 3 months off, got married, moved to beautiful Charleston, South Carolina, hung out on the beach, got bored after about 3 months, and started Q4Launch. So that's a little bit about me. Q4Launch is a company that specializes in travel or destination marketing. We work with bed and breakfast, resorts, vacation rentals, hotels from Hong Kong to Napa Valley and just about everywhere in between. So a lot of what you're going to learn from us today and that we'll share with you comes from our insights of being in the industry, of actually executing these strategies for customers, as well as just some of the things we're researching and developing from years of working in it. We also tend to move pretty fast through our webinars, so we will always make a recording available for you. Probably won't move quite as fast today as you may have noticed if you've been with us before. I have come down with a pretty nasty head cold. Just came back from a trip to see some family in Indiana, introduced our newborn daughter to family there, and the high was 4 degrees while we were there, so I basically died inside being from Charleston, going there and that temperature, and came back with a nasty head cold. So we probably won't move quite as fast today, but I will do my best to keep it high energy and try not to cough too much along the way. But thanks for your patience and understanding with that. So we will email out to a presentation. We will email out today's presentation probably early next week. So if you're live with us and you want to watch it again to try to keep some of that, let some of that set in or dive a little deeper, you can definitely listen to the recording. You can, of course, take notes as we move throughout our time together here as well. And then last bit of housekeeping, we will use the chat panel at the end of our time together for Q&A. This is the 4th highest attended webinar we've ever had, so that's exciting. And I know there's a lot of questions about the subject, because many of you have already emailed me lots of questions about the subject just in response to the invitation to attend the webinar. So we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can, and again, always happy to answer those questions via email after the fact as well. So let's dive in. We're going to do a little bit of introductory time together here to really look at some of the foundation behind yield management or revenue management, and then dive a little bit deeper on it in the second half of our time together today. So first, what is yield management? You probably have an understanding on this, but I want to touch on it really briefly. I want to use the terms yield management and revenue management a bit a bit intermixed today. Really, there's almost identical when you use the term. There's a slight difference, slight variation between the two, but almost identical from a concept, or at least the depth of concept we're going to get into it today. So you'll hear me use those terms interchangeably today, but we're talking about the same thing. But essentially, yield management is the changing of your prices to match fluctuations in supply and demand. That's basically what it is. It comes from the concept of you're trying to manage your yield or your revenue to the highest number possible. So based on the supply and the demand equation that you have at work, which we're going to dive deeper into that, you are manipulating your prices and your average nights per stay and the other factors that go into that to increase your yield to the highest possible place. And there's some great simulations out there and kind of quote-unquote games you can play where people have built yield management simulations and games to be able to actually play with that a little bit and test some of those things out. So some cool things you can do there. But the good news is, while yield management is something relatively new to the independent lodging section or segment, it's not new at all from a concept perspective. People have been doing it for years and years and years. And you're probably already doing it at some basic level. If you have seasonal or weekend pricing in your business, which I would bet almost all of us on this call do, if you don't, then that's a definite place to start. But I would bet almost all of us do. That's the very most basic level of yield management that you can be doing, is adjusting that based on the seasons and weekends and so forth. So if you're already doing it, you're already there, and your customers are used to it. So that's good news. You're already kind of got a toe in the water. As we do that, we want to talk a little bit about who are some of those common people using yield management. And you're seeing it. You see it every day as you interact. Your travelers, your guests, they're seeing it every day as they're interacting with the space. Airlines are probably the most common interaction most customers have with yield management. They are constantly using yield management to tweak their prices in a very dynamic model, a very, very advanced algorithm driving airline prices. I was just booking a trip to Branson actually last night, and it was amazing. For me to fly from Charleston to Branson was going to be $500, stopping in Atlanta. For me to fly from Columbia, South Carolina, which is about an hour and a half away, to Branson only cost me $95, still going through Atlanta. Which basically what that means is I'm going to be on the same flight from Atlanta to Branson, but my flight from Charleston to Atlanta was $400 more expensive than the flight from Columbia to Atlanta. That in and of itself is a great example of yield management. When I actually booked that flight and was in the part where I was choosing my seats, there were only 3 people who had actually bought that flight from Columbia to Atlanta, meaning that the demand for that flight from Columbia to Atlanta on that given day at that given time was very, very low. So that made the price very, very low because they were trying to fill that flight. On the flip side, demand for that flight from Charleston to Atlanta was very, very high, which had driven that price very, very high. $400 to take a 45-minute flight from Charleston to Atlanta is pretty ridiculous. But that's the basics of yield management. But we see it everywhere else: car rental agencies, sporting events, music venues, attractions, hotels, basically everyone in the hospitality industry. We don't see this as much in a lot of other industries, but you do see it some. I mean, happy hour is essentially, you could say it's a type of yield management. You know, they're trying to fill the dining room or fill their restaurant to sell alcohol, which is incredibly high margin, before the dinner crowd arrives. You know, they have a lower demand period of time, and they've taken to happy hour to try to fill that lower demand period of time. And it's very successful in most cases. I find myself at happy hour quite a bit. So definitely, enjoy that and everything it means. But you could say that that is basically yield management. They're trying to maximize their yield for their restaurant in a 4 to 7 o'clock time period that's traditionally pretty slow. You've got myself in there for happy hour, and you've got the seniors hitting up the MCL cafeteria. Those are about the only people that eat between 4 and 7 p.m. So it's a good opportunity for them to be able to drive that. So that's probably the last old people joke I'll make today. So I'll try to keep the MCL cafeteria references to a minimum. You probably don't even know what that is unless you're from the Midwest. But having just gone back to Indiana, I don't even know if MCL is still open. But that's not anywhere on my notes for our conference, on our topic today. So let's just move right on from that. But as we do that, you've heard me talk about supply and demand quite a bit. So if you did not take Economics 101 as you were coming up through college, then this is it for you. Economics 101, here it is. Supply and demand is ultimately what is at the core of making yield management decisions. On one axis, you have price, right? As price goes up on the left side there, you have quantity across the bottom axis there, and then you have supply and demand as your two, the other two lines on this graphic. Basically what this means is that where supply and demand meet, you have the perfect price. The perfect price is where your supply perfectly matched the demand. In reality, that never happens, right? You never have that perfect scenario. What that would mean is that you set your price at just the right spot where you sold to everyone who wanted to buy, but you didn't have to turn anyone away. And we know that doesn't happen. It just doesn't, there's no kind of perfect number there, but that's what we're trying to get to. And understanding that, if your supply stays the same, but your demand increases, in this case supply is rooms or units, properties, however you define that in your business, if your demand increases but your supply stays the same, your price is going to go up. If your supply increases but your demand stays the same, your price is going to go down. So that's that relationship that you're constantly looking at between supply and demand that's going to ultimately determine where the right price point is for your property to be. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into that. I wanted to get you on this basic philosophy here and maybe jot this graph down so you can kind of think about some things as we move together in our time. So a little bit more about the definition here. Supply, which I just touched on, equals the number of rooms or units that you have that are available to rent out on a given day. For most of us, this rarely changes. So we'll assume that supply is fixed throughout the year for the most part. You might have minor fluctuations, as a vacation rental company, and you're adding properties and dropping properties, but you're pretty standard, right? It's a pretty flat supply line all year long, which means the main thing that you're probably going to be looking at is changes in demand. But you also have to think about, it's not just the supply you have, but it's the supply your destination or your market has. So you got to be thinking about that. We're going to talk about competitive sets here a little bit later on. Demand is the number of people who want to book a specific unit for a specific period of time, whether that's a room, a house, anything. We're wrapping that into the term unit here. And that is dramatically different throughout the year. We know this is constantly fluctuating. Because of that fluctuation, most of us are already using seasonal or weekend rates. As we talked about earlier, that's yield management at its most basic level. But you have to get a handle on the demand to be able to determine supply. So most of what we're going to talk about today is going to be on the demand side of this equation. We'll talk a little bit more about supply. We'll talk a little bit about competitive sets, but we'll mostly be talking about demand and how to measure that and how to respond based on the demand that you're seeing. So what it's kind of a good thing to be thinking about is that demand side of this equation. How many people are looking to book a property for a specific weekend, day, week, whatever. So we'll dive a little bit deeper. And as I referenced earlier, where supply and demand meet, you'll find the perfect price, which means a couple things. That means that how much you feel your room is worth or how much you feel a property is worth is absolutely irrelevant. One of the things that we use sometimes as an example is sporting events. I traveled, I try to go to a good number of sporting events, being a big sports fan, but I went to the Final Four several years ago up in Detroit. Detroit has had a rough go of things with the economy and everything else, not exactly a hotbed for travel and tourism. But when the final floor was there, let me tell you, we stayed an hour away and probably spent $250 a night on a pretty mid-grade Hampton Inn. But demand was really high, so they found their perfect price to be $250 for those rooms on those given days. That room was absolutely not worth $250. Like, nothing about it was worth $250. But that's what the demand was for that room for that given day, so they were able to rent that out. So if you ask the manager, do you feel like your room is worth $250? He probably would have said no. We don't have the amenities, we don't have all this, we don't have the level of service you'd expect from a hotel getting $250 a night. But bottom line was the final floor was in town, which meant his room was worth $250. And I'm really hitting on that, excuse me, hitting on that because we want to take the feeling out of it. We're in a very feel-good industry, and it's important to us that our guests feel good about the experience they have. I mean, that's ultimately what value is all about. The value is, the feeling that you're getting what you paid for. You're getting more than what you paid for. But sometimes you have to let go of that emotional side and just look at the numbers to be able to make these decisions. So we want you to connect with that. Today's not going to be the emotional, warm, fuzzy conversation that some of the webinars we have are really. When we're talking about marketing, we're talking about evoking those emotional responses. Yield management's not that. Yield management is very black and white. It's very numbers driven, very analytical. It's not so much about the warm fuzzies, about marketing and so forth, although that, of course, drives demand. So I wanted to get that out there, and that's a common misconception as we talk to people about yield management that we get is they want to evolve the emotional in the equation, and the emotional really isn't evolved in this equation. There are things you do to drive the emotional response, which increases demand, which we'll talk about, but the emotional shouldn't be a factor in your ultimate pricing decision. So as we do that, and I kind of referenced this, but as we think about how do we increase demand, I've talked about the fact that that is the #1 way we're going to be able to raise price is by increasing demand. Great marketing will increase demand for your product, ultimately being responsible for raising your price. So this is another misconception we run into quite a bit about marketing. And we get this idea that, oh, I'm already 80% booked in peak season, or I'm already 100% booked for these 3 months. I don't really know that I need to be doing more marketing. And that can't be further from the truth. If we do more marketing, even if we're 100% booked, we're increasing demand by doing great marketing, which further allows us to increase our price. If you're already 100% booked for any period of the year, you should be using yield management to get more aggressive and generate a higher yield out of that availability. But then if you invest into marketing, you're going to drive more demand. You're going to increase that demand even more so. Your supply is going to stay the same. That's going to let you take your price that much higher. So definitely an important thing to be thinking about as you are, working towards this and trying to understand this whole equation. If in 2016 you've made a decision to invest in increased marketing, then this could be a great year for you to start with yield management. If you haven't already started with it, or maybe if you have dabbled with it a bit, maybe it's a great year for you to get more aggressive with yield management or revenue management. But marketing is ultimately what's going to drive demand, and demand is ultimately what's going to drive price. So it's that relationship that you got to see and work towards those things. So we'll circle back to that a little bit later. One of the other questions that we get sometimes is, how does the quality of my properties or my rooms, my service, and my amenities factor in? Quality is absolutely an important factor. You cannot ignore quality. There are situations like the Hampton Inn example I just gave where because of the incredible demand on a destination, that quality isn't as much of a factor. The demand is so high, we've kind of superseded quality as a factor. But that still plays in at some level, because a $250 hotel probably would have gone to $600 for the final floor. And a $125 hotel went to $250. So it's definitely a factor there. The other part of it to think about is the fact that typically if you have a higher quality, you're going to have a higher demand, and the more someone is going to be willing to pay for that in the first place. At a very basic level, right? I mean, we know that there are not a ton of people out there that will pay $1,000 a night for a hotel. We represent some hotels that charge $1,000 a night, but we know it's a very unique group, and I'm not saying just because it's a higher quality, we know there's more demand. But big picture, people would rather stay at a higher quality place, everything else being equal, right? So there is more demand for that type of product, and the more someone is willing to pay for that type of product. So you've got to be thinking about that as well, which involves that piece of it where you've got to think about some of the emotional side of it and be able to say, you know, what is a room worth? You have to be able to really factor that in and make sure that you're not overdoing it from a rate perspective, because that's an important thing to think about too. You don't want to overstretch and have really unhappy guests because of how much something costs. You know, in most cases, I think we overestimate that. I think people know when they're booking what they're booking. I wasn't upset about the fact that I had to pay $250 for that Hampton Inn. I got it. You know, it's the Final Four. Like, a ton of people are here. Everybody needs a place to stay. I just get it. You know, I'm not upset with the Hampton Inn for taking advantage of that opportunity to generate a higher yield for themselves. So something to be thinking about there as a part of your equation as well. All right. So then this kind of leads to that conversation, and where we're going to go with the rest of our time here is, are you a good candidate for yield management? I would bet if you're on this call, you're probably a good candidate for yield management. There's a couple things you can, questions you can ask yourself to see if you are, but I would bet just about everybody here is. There's not very many people we have conversations with that aren't good candidates. But do you run 70+% occupancy for any specific period of the year? Or do you routinely sell out specific periods of the year, weekends, whatever else? I was having a conversation with a couple of hoteliers late last week, and we were just talking about, we were comparing some data, and they were talking back and forth, and they were talking about this specific issue of yield management. One of them had lowered rates quite a bit for the February month. It's kind of an off month for them. And he was feeling pretty good that, you know, he had driven a certain occupancy level. He lowered his rates to get there and had got to a certain revenue number for that period of time. The other hotelier had kept his rates pretty aggressive. He had less bookings. He had been able to reduce staff count for that period of time, everything else. And his occupancy rate was lower, right? Lower occupancy, lower staff costs, lower food costs, all those other factors going into that. And he had booked almost the identical amount of revenue, $500 less actually. He had $500 less on his books for February last week when we were having this conversation than the other guy. And then the first gentleman who had a higher occupancy rate, a lot of us would say, okay, that guy won. He got a higher occupancy. He has $500 more in revenue. But he was actually saying, man, I blew it. I had my rates too low. Because the second hotelier actually is going to have a much more profitable month. Even though his revenue will be a little bit lower, he was getting a higher per room fee, and he was able to do that with less staff, less expenses, which drives a much higher profitability and less headaches to deal with. So there's a lot going into that there. Neither one of those was at 70% occupancy for the month, but both of those were using yield management principles to be able to determine what they were trying to accomplish with their revenue for that specific month and how they wanted to go about doing their yield management for that month, even in a slower season. So really a great conversation to be a part of. As I was preparing for this, it wasn't why I was on the call. We were talking about some of the things, but that's, you know, at the basics what we're talking about. You're able to manipulate that price to find that sweet spot for the level of bookings that you want to have in a given period of time, and everything else that you're kind of looking to pull from that. So good thing to be thinking about there, and as we're kind of framing this conversation. So we touched on this, but if more demand equals higher rates, how do we drive more demand? Great marketing is going to be one of the best ways to do that. More website traffic is going to ultimately mean more demand for you. I'm not going to spend a ton of time doing that, but we wanted to just touch base and get that information out there. As you're looking on driving the demand, we had that question come up in email a lot, so we wanted to touch on it a little bit there. So how do we get started? How do we get started in this whole process, right? We got a little bit of an understanding of what it's about. We're going to give you some more of that background as we continue to move along here. But how do we get started? The quickest way to get started is to really look back at your last 2 years of occupancy data and analyze periods that you ran higher than 70% occupancy. You don't have to restrict it to these periods, as I just talked about that February example. But it's where you're going to see the most bang for your buck most likely with yield management is in higher occupancy periods of time. You also have to get an understanding of what good occupancy looks like in your local market, or in a specific period of time, even like the February example I just gave. 60% occupancy might be good some parts of the year, and you should start yielding as you get closer to it. So when you get to 40%, maybe you should be yielding because you're already starting to kind of get close to that number you want to be at. Or maybe in February, 60% occupancy is good, but you want to lower it by driving rate higher and reducing expenses, or your staffing is harder that time of year, so you know you're going to have less people, so you need to demand a higher price because you're going to have more expensive staff, or whatever the factors are that go into that. You can be adjusting the rate to and your booking criteria to get to the yield that you want to have for that specific period of time. And then as you do this, analyzing occupancy on a per room or per unit level will help you understand and help you see if you need to be managing yield for certain rooms or certain accommodation types separately from others. This is less of a big deal on the hotel side of things, much bigger deal on the vacation rental side of things, most notably because hotels typically have a smaller variance between their rooms, whereas vacation rentals, every house is pretty different. But the best way to do that would be every unique accommodation type, whether that's a unique house or a unique room, for example, in a bed and breakfast case, our rooms are very different from each other. You should be monitoring occupancy and rate and yield based off of that. For a lot of the inns that we represent, some of their highest price rooms actually carry the highest occupancy, which goes back to that point about higher quality equals higher demand that we talked a little bit about earlier. And we've made suggestions to certain people by analyzing that. When we see that, hey, your higher quality rooms or your king bed rooms or whatever the criteria is are actually running higher occupancies, we've told people to invest into improving the quality of their rooms. So some people have this perception that I need to have a lower price entry point room because it makes my product available to more people. I don't disagree with that. But if your data tells you that your highest price rooms, highest quality rooms carry higher occupancy than your lower price ones, maybe you need to be investing in improving your lower quality room and taking that price on that room higher to be able to ultimately drive more revenue, more yield for your property as a whole. And just say, I don't need to pick up that business at that lower price point. I'm going to focus on building higher quality into my accommodations. But the only way you can figure that out is if you analyze that occupancy or that revenue on a per room or per unit level like we referenced there. So that's the basics of how you're going to get started. If you can go back further than 2 years, that's great as well. But 2 years is kind of a minimum. We would recommend going back and looking at that data. Awesome. Here we're going to talk about booking pace. And this is one of the most important concepts you can really connect with when you're trying to manage your yield effectively. So we're going to spend a little bit more time hanging out here and talking about this. This is a conversation we've had with several of the property management software companies out there in the space. We think they can do a better job of helping people understand pace, which we'll talk about. And I think several of them have some things they're working on in this, and we're excited to see that come out. An improvement in this functionality as more people are having this conversation and demanding this. So if you, encourage you to ask your revenue or your property management software, your booking engine, to incorporate pacing reports into them if they're not already there, and if they are there but they're not really helping you and meeting the needs you have, communicate to them about how they can improve those reports to help you. But pace is essentially how fast you're booking rooms for future dates. So at this point last year, how much did I already have on the books for a future date? If you are ahead of last year's pace, that's a signal that you can increase your rate because you're already filling up for those dates faster than you did last year. If you're behind on those dates, that's a sign that you probably need to lower rate for those dates. And it's all about ahead or behind really comes back down to that demand equation. If you're booking ahead of last year's pace, you're closer to being full than you were at this point last year, you can increase your rate. So a lot of us should be looking at booking pace right now for the summer of 2016. For a lot of people, that's a very peak season of travel. If we wait till summer of 2016 to start trying to manage yield for that period of time, we've already missed the boat. But we need to be tracking booking pace now so that we understand where are we at for next summer. Are we booking ahead of pace for next summer, or are we booking behind pace? We're seeing a lot of interesting data in the travel space right now, lots of interesting kind of weird quirks happening. I think some of it's being driven by El Nino and the weather phenomenon that's going out west right now with how incredible strong ski season they're having. But there's a lot happening. And I think we're in a unique place and love being in this place because we have data coming from so many properties that we're able to really get a good view of what's happening across the country and to some degree across the world as well. But you've really got to be honed in on that pace to be able to say, what's my summer going to look like? And being able to answer that question for yourself right now will really help you be able to do that. Another way of really looking at that is if you're getting lots of requests for specific dates in the future, you're getting lots of requests, but maybe the bookings aren't there yet, that's a signal to increase rate. You know, if you're getting lots of requests for specific dates, you might not have any idea why, but you might go ahead and increase your rate because a lot of people are calling or whatever else. That's a signal that there's a lot of demand for those dates. Again, it all comes back down to that, right? We're trying to measure the demand for a specific period of time. If your weekends are filling up ahead of your usual booking window, increase rate. So what do I mean by booking window? I mean, this is just another way of measuring pace here. But you know typically that if maybe your properties book 4 weeks in advance or your rooms typically book 4 weeks in advance, but you're looking ahead at May and you've got a pretty full calendar for May already, man, something's going on. We're booking May faster than we usually do. We're booking May ahead of pace. Maybe for the weekends you have left unbooked in May, you take that signal and say, okay, I need to raise my rate. I need to raise rate for the weekends I have left. Maybe you carry that on into June and July and say, you know, this is something, this is a trend I'm seeing in May. I don't think it's anything unique about May. I think we're going to see a strong summer this year, so we're going to drive rate a little bit higher. So definite opportunity for you to be able to do that as well. But you've got to have a handle on that and looking at your calendar and looking at pace. And that's why, you know, saying May is booking up faster than it did last year is important, as opposed to just May is booking up. You know, May might always book up at this time of year. I don't know in your property or your destination, but you've got to be looking at it and trying to compare it to the pace you had last year, which is an important thing to be looking at. Sorry, it's for a water break there. I try to keep the cost from coming back. But and then last thing here, and this isn't quite as scientific, but to track turnaways and note it for year over year. Turnaways are an important thing to be thinking about because turnaways are the people that you could have booked that you can't because you're already booked up. And those are not necessarily a good thing. Remember, we talk about where supply and demand meet. You have the perfect price. If you're turning people away, your demand has exceeded your supply, which means you left money on the table. Your rate was too low for that period of time. And by tracking turnaways and keeping that log of turnaways, you're going to set yourself up for next year being in a better place. So you can then look and see, you know, the first weekend in May is graduation weekend, and there's a college in my town, and I turned away 20 families looking to make a stay. Or to have a stay for graduation weekend. If you turned away 20 people, chances are your price was too low for graduation weekend or whatever that weekend. Maybe there wasn't even an event that weekend, but you turned a lot of people away. That's a signal for you that your price was too low or your rate was too low for that period of time. And now we know for next year, I'd go ahead and update my price and say, you know, that first weekend in May or every weekend in May or every weekend all summer, I need to raise my rate because I turned a lot of people away that I could have booked that would have been willing to pay. And the other way of doing this, and we're going to talk about minimum night stays here in a little bit, is increasing minimum night stays. You know, maybe you feel like your room is only worth a certain threshold, right? So you yield your price as high as you feel like. We talked about not doing things based on how you feel, but we know that is at some level part of the equation. You raise your rate as high as you feel like you can take it without getting uncomfortable with the value proposition you're providing. So your next step is maybe to say, okay, I can't push rate any higher, but instead of a 2-night minimum on those weekends, maybe I'm going to push it to a 3, or maybe I'm going to push a 3 to a 4. There's other ways to increase yield besides just rate all the time, and we're going to talk about those, not in depth, but a little bit on one of our future slides here together. So Really want you to get and understand that pace piece of it, though. That's absolutely critical. And then as you're doing that, make sure that some of the pricing adjustments you want to be thinking about. You always have to know your local events calendar and adjust price each year for events that you sell out. If you are routinely selling out specific events, and we know there's a lot of festivals in so many destinations, so many visitors bureaus and destination marketing organizations are doing such a great job putting on these events to be able to bring people into your town in otherwise slow times. So that's great, but you've got to be tracking those events like a hawk, you know, and being all over that. Not getting too aggressive. You know, I think Charleston is maybe an example of at times being too aggressive. I think our hoteliers last year got a little bit over-aggressive with some of our bridge run pricing, and we saw kind of a shift in that bridge run pricing that pushed people into other locations, pushed people more towards other segments of the market. But you don't want to get too aggressive, but at the same time, you want to hone in on what those events are, whether you've got I said the bridge run, many of you probably don't know what that is. It's a run here in Charleston across our iconic bridge, brings about 40,000 runners, which usually means probably, I don't know, 100,000 people that come to experience that event. So a huge demand on our city. But you also got to think about, you know, what are peak weekends for weddings? You know, weddings are a huge demand on Charleston. I would imagine they're a big demand in other cities as well. And if you know there's going to be a lot of weddings in your town or any event, just plug in that blank with whatever the events that happen in your destination are. Think about those times a year those things are happening. Think about the times that you always sell out. If you are consistently selling out an event or a period of time of any type, weekends in peak season, all days in peak season, then you need to be looking at yielding those prices. And then monitoring supply in your destination is really important as well. Because if there is an increase in supply, you've got to be thinking about the fact that that could drive rate down. And we don't like getting ahead of price decreases, right? Nobody wants to get on that bandwagon. That's like the negative side of yield management. But it's something to think about. We are seeing a record pace of hotel growth right now, a record pace of new hotel construction in so many markets. We talked about that last year in several webinars, and we're still seeing that. Many of those hotels that were being built last year that we talked about are now open, and their doors are open to people. There's so much happening in the industry from Expedia acquiring HomeAway and all that inventory rolling in there. There's so much happening from growth in the Airbnb world, and so many people becoming a lodging alternative for people, whether that's the shared room, shared economy, or if it's just traditional vacation rental stuff. Most of us, if not all of us, are facing higher supply this year than we did last year. And last year there was more supply than there was the year before. It's exciting that the economy is rebounding to a certain degree. I don't want to get into a political discussion about some of that data that's coming out, but it's exciting that that's all happening. But at the same time, that means there's more people entering the market. There's more investment entering the market. There's more investors coming to the table and building stuff, and that's meaning an increase in supply. And you have to think about that and how that's going to impact your business as well, and how is that going to impact your ability to price your property effectively. So lots going on, lots to think about from that pricing perspective. Didn't want to spend too much time talking about the negative side of the supply increase, but it's something to think about. You know, definitely a factor. And we wanted to touch on competitive set. You know, that's what really measuring that supply is all about. You need to develop a competitive set in your marketplace, and we recommend tracking that competitive set regularly in a spreadsheet. By tracking them on a regular basis, you're going to get a picture on when or if they're yielding their rates. And it's going to also help you understand the price ranges that they're yielding within. As you figure out where your competitors are yielding rate, you can yield accordingly based on your relationship from a quality perspective and your aggressiveness from a marketing perspective. Just because someone's yielding at a lower price than you does not mean you need to adjust to that. There are so many other equations that go into where your price should be, or so many other factors that go into the equation on where your price should be. Most notably, how aggressive are you from a marketing perspective? We talked about marketing drives demand, demand drives price. If you're marketing more than your competition is, or you have a stronger brand, that's part of the demand equation. Your demand is higher, your price should be higher. But it will help you understand how they're doing that and when they're yielding that. A great way to get insights into this too, if you have a large property in your area, a large high-quality property probably, I don't think you'll run into this quite as much. It's just the average Hampton Inns of the world or those types of places. But if you have a property that has a true revenue manager on their staff, somebody that manages this every day for that property, and I say a larger one because the smaller properties typically can't afford to have revenue managers on staff, but somebody who can afford a good revenue manager as a staff position, that is somebody to track, because those people are full-time dedicated to understanding the supply and demand equation for their specific destination, for their specific hotel. And you can learn a lot about what they think is happening in the marketplace by watching the way that they're yielding their rates for future dates. So a good opportunity there. Hopefully you can find a competitive set, and maybe you can build a profile off of somebody who's in your marketplace who has a revenue manager, and you can learn from some of the things that they're doing there. But this competitive set is such an important thing to be thinking about and doing the local market research based on your competitive set to really see what's going on there and seeing where they're showing up and what their prices are. And you can also track this across multiple mediums. You know, they might have a different price on their website than they have out through the online travel agencies or other places they might be listed on the web. So important thing to be looking at that as well. And seeing where you stack up in those competitive sets. You know, if you're listing on Booking.com or other OTAs, your competitive set may be different there than it is if someone is just doing a Google search and finding you. So based on where a consumer is looking for accommodations, the competitive set can vary for you as well. So something to think about. Once you've established those periods, we're going to talk about kind of implementing some things here. But once you've established the periods that you're looking to do yield management for, which it doesn't have to just be at certain occupancy thresholds. It could be, you know, in February, trying to maximize profitability there, like we talked about earlier. But we want to establish some rules to live by. I don't think there's very many people on the call today who probably are big enough that they could say, you know, I can spend $80,000 a year on a full-time revenue manager, which is realistically what a good revenue manager is going to cost. So there's probably not too many of us on the call who are going to go out and hire that person. So for us, we want to do some of the more basic pieces of yield management that we've laid out for you today, and then ultimately we hopefully can establish some rules to live by. And as we're doing that, we can really drive greater yield for our properties, higher profitability, without having to spend 40 hours a month trying to manage this. But as you do that, there's a couple examples for you. You may create a rule in your property management software that says at 70% occupancy for future dates, I'm going to increase my rate by 10%. So $200 rate becomes $220. At 80% occupancy, I'm going to increase my rate another 10%. At 90% occupancy, I'm going to increase my rate another 10%. So if you weren't yielding before, you would have stayed at that 200 and you would have sold out and you'd have been happy about it because you felt like you accomplished something. And that's great. You did. You sold out your rooms or your properties at $200 a night. Awesome. But by using some of these established rules and creating this criteria, you were actually able to get this additional profitability out of these rooms that you would have had before. And this is so let's just say you make a 25% margin on that room, so you take home 50. You know, after your expenses are paid and everything else, you take home $50 of profit on that $200 a night sale. If you yield your price up to $240 because of demand, that room you sold at $240 didn't cost you anything more than the room you sold at $200. So it still cost you $150 to deliver that, but your profit on that went from $50 to $90. So by increasing your rate and using yield management to be able to do that, you've taken a $50 profit, turned it into a $90 profit, which is an 80% increase in profitability, which is absolutely huge when you really look at that from a profit perspective. And a small increase in price, right, 200 to 240 is a 20% increase in price. A 20% increase in price resulted in an 80% increase in profit. That is how we got the title for our presentation today. Work more and work less and make more money, right? I mean, that's the name of the game. You might have fewer room nights booked, but you're making more money as a result, just as the hotelier number 2 I shared in that February example. Working less but making more profit. So that looks like I got ahead of myself on that example. I got so excited and just got a little bit ahead of it on that. But a 20% increase in rate driving an 80% increase in profit is the name of the game. I mean, that's what yield management is about, and being able to help you accomplish those things. And we talked about this earlier as well. You know, don't just think rate when you're thinking yield management. Think minimum night stays. Minimum night stays are a really powerful way to be able to really adjust this. I was talking to some people in the vacation rental space. They're in an urban market. Urban markets typically don't have the week-long stays like a lot of resort markets do. So again, I was talking to 2 vacation rental managers about what the growth in the urban vacation rental market and some of those other things. And we were talking about minimum night stays. And one guy was like, man, I'm totally booked up for March, April, May. Like, all my weekends are already booked. And I was like, well, that's awesome, man. Like, congratulations. Deep down, I knew that wasn't really awesome for him because that means his price was too low. But I said, so as you saw March starting to book up, did you adjust your minimum night stays for April and May? He's like, no, I got a 2-night minimum stay. I was like, oh, man, you left a ton on the table because by booking those weekends for 2 nights, you've left a stranded Thursday night that now is very, very unlikely to get booked. So with that, understanding that, yeah, maybe only 20% of weekend travelers are going to stay 3 nights. But if you routinely sell out your weekends, only sell to that 20% by putting a 3-night minimum stay on your properties for that period of time, because that unbooked Thursday night is going to be absolutely worthless to you in most cases. And if you pick up that Thursday night, that's a great way to increase your yield. It's a great way to increase your average booking without even having to increase your rate. You know, maybe your rate is, as we talked about earlier, as high as you're comfortable taking it from a value perspective. So maybe your solution is to add that 3-night stay onto a weekend and see what that does and be able to get that. You know, pick up that Thursday night. That's going to take that booking and increase it by roughly, 50%, assuming your Thursday night rate's the same as your Friday, Saturday night rate. You're going to increase your yield by 50% there without having to actually raise your price. It's a hugely profitable way to grow your business because it doesn't mean a full room turn either. You don't have that same expense for turning that guest over. You've already educated them about your properties. You've already done all the work. That third night is much lower from a work perspective for those people. Make sure that your minimum night stays are going to vary by season and events as well. You know, if you have iconic events and the people might come for an entire week for that event, typically you've got a 2-night minimum or a 3-night minimum. Maybe it should be a 4 or a 5-night minimum for that particular time. You know, I went to Savannah to run a marathon a few years ago, and a lot of the properties downtown Savannah where I wanted to stay said, hey, we got a 4-night minimum. I was like, I'm not only coming for 3, but would love to stay. And like, sorry, we got a 4-night minimum. You don't have to stay all 4, but you have to book all 4 because I know somebody is going to book for 4 nights. And they were right. I'm sure they booked up. You know, I decided not to stay there because I was traveling with a group of 12, and they didn't want to pay for a night they weren't going to use, so we ended up having to stay a little bit further away, somewhere that only had a 3-night minimum. But that's a way to manage that yield as well and to drive yield higher for that period of time. So lots of ways you can really manage yield without just managing rate. You know, if you're in that place of being as high as you think you can go on rate, some other great ways to manage your yield there to drive yield higher or drive your revenue higher. And then if you have a lot of drive-in business, you know, in Charleston we see a lot of this because people they'll come to Charleston, they'll be driving kind of maybe up and down the East Coast. They want to visit South Carolina, or they want to visit Asheville, Charleston, Savannah. We see that trip quite a bit. So if you're doing that, you know, people come to Charleston, they love it. They check in. Maybe they're checking in on Friday, they're checking out on Sunday. You know Sunday night's a really low night. At check-in, or maybe when you send them their welcome letter, offer an extend your stay special. so that people can say, you know what, I'm loving my trip to Charleston. I'm not ready to leave yet. I'm going to extend my stay. I'm going to add a third night and offer a 2-minute discount. You know, that room is a perishable item. Once that Sunday night is over and that room sat empty, you're never going to get that inventory back. So it's a great opportunity to go ahead and book that room and use that extend your stay special to be able to do that. And as you work through this and you establish these rules for yourself, I know it's probably a lot of overwhelming information. We want to give you more information than you had today when you came in, no matter wherever your education level is out. We wanted you to learn something and spark a new idea today. But automate as much of this as possible, because it is a lot to try to manage this. And a lot of property management software and booking engines have basic automated yield management functionality built right in. I say basic because if you're going to automate it, it can only be so advanced. But it's better than nothing. You know, you're probably not ready to make that jump and hire a full-time yield manager, but you can start setting up some of those automated rules. And then check your competition weekly for multiple date sets. Update that tracking spreadsheet I told you earlier. You know, as you're creating that competitive set and you're tracking that in the spreadsheet, and you're tracking your turnaways and you're doing all that, update that on a weekly basis for multiple date sets so you can see how your competitors are adjusting yield if they are. If you see a competitor that's never adjusting their yield, maybe you quit tracking because it's not a good benchmark to use. But tracking that competitive set will really help you understand, and then tracking your historical performance as well will help you understand how you need to be changing things for next year. So you got to invest some time this year to set yourself up next year with more data, more power, more results. Can really help you out there. And then one other important concept you need to walk away with here, and that's this concept, that unbooked nights are not the enemy. So many of us have been trained for so many years that occupancy is our goal, and that is absolutely not true. Revenue is our goal. We're a business owner. We're operating a business. We're a marketing manager, whatever role you're in your business. Revenue and ultimately profitability is your goal. If you have 10 rooms and you only book 80 of them, excuse me, if you have 10 rooms and you book 8 of them, that's 80% occupancy, and your other competitors might laugh when they see that you've got unbooked rooms for that weekend, and they think they've outsmarted you, they're better than you, because they have 10 rooms and they booked 10 rooms. But if you look at that minimum night stay piece alone, not even looking at yield or rate, if you have 10 rooms and 8 of them you book at a 3-night minimum stay and 2 of them go unbooked, you might feel like you failed, but if you look at that numbers, that means you did $4,800 in revenue that weekend. Whereas if your competitor has 10 rooms and he books all 10 of them for 2 nights at $200 a night, he feels like he's accomplished something. He's 100% occupied. He is the man. And he has $4,000 in revenue for that period of time. So he feels good about himself, when in reality, you can laugh all the way to the bank because you have $800 more in revenue, and most likely you have more than that from a profitability perspective. But any period of time that you're 100% booked, chances are you left money on the table. The only way you didn't leave money on the table if you're 100% booked is if you had your price perfect. That perfect supply meets demand situation that I talked about is so rare to actually find that perfect price. So again, I apologize. I know that is absolutely terrible to have to hear that on a webinar. My apologies. I didn't want to cancel today. There was many people as we had registered. I want to tough through it for you. But chances are, if you were 100% booked, you left some money there on the table. So I know this is a lot of information. You know, if you've been with us on webinars before, we don't like to overwhelm you with information and then leave you hanging. We want to help you take your next steps. We want to help you get started. So to do that today, we're making available something. It's a bit time-consuming on our part, so we don't do this very often. We only did it once all of last year. I don't know how much we'll do it this year, but not much because it is very time-consuming. But if you need help getting started, you can request a free yield management consultation to get help from our team. We've got a team of about 30 very talented hospitality marketers who really understand this stuff and would be happy to help you take your next steps and talk to you about where you are and help you get started. We're going to send an email out after this. I'll send an email out with an invitation to request that free yield management consultation We just ask that you go to our website and fill out a form. It just helps us track that and make sure that we're not missing anybody. Gets us a little bit more information as well ahead of time so we can help you and make sure that we're prepared for that calls going into it. And then we'll spend about 30 minutes with you to schedule a consultation and kind of talk through this, answer any questions you have more in depth than we can answer them on the webinar together today, and help you get started with yield management in your business. So I encourage you to keep an eye on your inbox for that and take advantage of that opportunity. Again, we will also send a copy of the recording out first next week. So if you've come in late and missed part of it, no stress. We've been recording today's session, and you can listen to me cough all over again. Again, I'm sorry about that. So you have questions, we have answers. Looking forward to jumping into the chat panel, seeing that blow up here a few times. So hopefully we can dive in here and get some questions answered. If you have a question, now is a great time to drop that in the chat panel as well. And we'll do our best to get that answered for you together here today in these last few minutes we have. All right. All right, lots of questions here. How do you determine quality? TripAdvisor, AAA ratings? Yeah, great question. Quality is overall quality of a hotel. There are so many factors that go into that. Or a property. Amenities is a big part of that. You know, what the rooms are like, how big the rooms are, the location of the property compared to its competitive set. TripAdvisor reviews, definitely a factor of quality or perceived quality on the view of the traveler. There is a research done, and I can't remember which, I believe it was a university put it out, somebody may know, but they said every position you go up on TripAdvisor rankings, you can charge 10% more for your room. So if you go from position 3 to position 2, you can increase your price by 10% and keep the same level of bookings. They found that through a study that they did. So we don't see AAA ratings carrying as much weight as they used to from a sheer quality perspective. Just don't see as many people putting a lot of stock in that as a quality factor. But there is, you know, still some of that out there. But there's a lot that goes into that quality equation for a particular property. But thanks for that question. Some comments about why hotels factor RevPAR as opposed to occupancy and ADR. Absolutely, yeah, that's a very good point. RevPAR stands for revenue per available room. Didn't touch on RevPAR today as part of our conversation, but I think this person was commenting just that the RevPAR is a more indicative of how successful things are maybe than occupancy or ADR. So good comment there. Another comment here, you can do pace on an Excel spreadsheet. Absolutely, yeah. Excel spreadsheet's a great way to track pace. You just have to get ahead of it from a tracking perspective to be able to do that. Question here, how do you find out about your competitors? Well, hopefully you know who your competitors are in your local market. And then from there, you just act like a consumer. You just go online and you do a search for accommodations that are similar to yours. You search for certain dates, and you make note of what price that they're pricing their property out for those dates. So it's really that simple. You're just figuring out who your competitive set is, and then doing a search for particular dates and seeing what their rates are for those dates, and then looking at that, how that compares. Comment here. See if your CVB has TravelClick's destination insights. It shows pace for the entire market for the next 365 days. Great feedback there. Absolutely, yeah. There's a company called TravelClick which puts out a report called Destination Insights, which will help you understand pace for the entire market, or your entire market or your entire destination. And a lot of CVBs subscribe to that, so as a member of a CVB, you may be able to get access to that report. So thanks for that feedback. Appreciate that. I am about out of my talking ability here, so let's see if we can answer these next few questions. Could you please give me some ideas on how to track my competitors and turnaways? Just shared some ideas on tracking competitors, absolutely. Turnaways, I would just say whether you're answering your phone or you have a reservation team answering your phone, if they are turning people away and telling them that they are already booked up, mark that down and keep a tracking spreadsheet for every weekend of the year or every period of time, however you typically book. If you're booking weekends heavy or if you're week heavy or whatever, track those, or maybe it's by date and say, okay, I am already booked up for this period in May, so I turned somebody away for a 4-night booking May 7th through the 11th, or whatever. And you're just tracking that so you can get an idea and look back a year later and say, you know, at the end of this year, you can say, wow, we turned a lot of people away in May. That's the indicator we're after. That's telling us we need to raise our price for May. So that's what we're trying to do there. Hopefully that's helpful and answers your question. If not, we would be happy to connect with you more in depth on that. Comment here, feel better, Matt. This was great. Awesome. Thanks so much. Appreciate that and the well wishes there. I hope I feel better too. Do you have a yearly spreadsheet template that you can share? That's a great question, something I was thinking about as I was preparing for this. I don't, but that's probably something we could prepare and share for you at some future time, but we don't have that right now. Another question there about a spreadsheet. Another question about how to evaluate and determine your competitive set. I think we've probably answered that since that question was asked. So we're going to keep moving here. I came in late. What do you recommend for adjusting rates at 1 week out in terms of a percentage or a dollar amount? Is this a set amount? I never seem to increase rates. I only decrease them last minute. Frowny face. I can definitely relate to that frowny face. We want to be on the other side of that yield management piece, right? We want to be on the increased rate side of yield management, not the decreased rate side of it. So as far as changing for a last minute booking, that's a very personal thing. That's market by market. So Julie, please do take advantage of that 30-minute yield management consultation, and we'd be happy to help you look at that. We'd also be happy to help you tackle that issue of increasing rates, not decreasing them at the last minute, because that's a lot more exciting when you increase rate and you see the booking come in for those increased rates. So Julie, that's something we'd love to connect with you on, or anybody else would love to connect with you. If you're in that same place as Julie, that is not the side of yield management you want to be on being forced to decrease rate to fill occupancy. Now, there is a time and place for that, but we want to be on the other side where we're filling up so much that we're increasing rate. Question here, what's the best management system for small properties that make yield management easier, more automatic? Great question. There's a couple. There is ResNexus has a great tool in their software to be able to help you manage yield management and automate some of that. All those automation pieces have some limitations, but they have some good stuff. I'm actually going to be speaking on yield management at their user conference, so excited to do that, and we're going to dive deeper into their tool when we do that. Think Reservations also has some yield management built into theirs. Those are two specific ones we use in the innkeeping world that are some of the best that we've found. So. How do you get a sense of turnaways using online booking? Great question, John. It's harder. You would definitely have to have that built into your reservation system. There's no way to really know it if your reservation system doesn't have a way to track it. That's one of those things I would encourage you to ask your reservation system to add. Not only to track turnaways, but also track searched dates and be able to report on that. Because if you see a spike in searches for a particular date range, that's an indicator that demand is higher for that date range, and you'd want to raise price ahead of that. So not just turnaways, but also searches in general. If your booking system can track those, that's a great way to do that. Do you know what reservation systems or booking engines are developing better yield management capabilities? Answered that one as well. Yeah, the two I would check out there are ResNexus and Think Reservations. Nice comment here from John. Not a question, but a very good talk. Cough, not a problem. Thanks, John. I appreciate your grace on that as I suffer through here and try to help you all out the best we can. Comment from somebody that they think Reservations is the only company offering a pacing report of the major players in online reservation management programs. I would say is a very specific comment to the innkeeping space. There are many other companies providing that. Outside of the innkeeping space, the hotel world is prolific with pace reports. We see a lot more of the vacation rental side of it as well. And ResNexus actually is in the development process on their pacing report. So there's a lot going on there. So, question here, another question. We've had bookings come in for increased rates using advanced rates in Escapia, and it's exciting and does it automatically. Absolutely great comment, Allison. Thanks for that. Escapia does have some automation built in as well, which is a property management system on in the vacation rental side of the industry. So thanks for that comment. It is exciting when you see those come in, even more so when that was an automatic change that happened. So Awesome. Well, hopefully that was helpful. You know, I've managed to get through with the voice that I have, and look forward to connecting with you all on the free yield management consultation. So thanks for coming today. Hopefully you learned something new and got sparked with some new ideas today. And we will look forward to talking to you all again soon. We have another webinar coming up next week, so stay tuned to your inbox for an invitation to that webinar as well. One of our other associates, Stephen Wright, will be teaching that webinar, so keep an eye out for that. He always does great webinars and great topics. I know I got great feedback from many of you all who were on his last webinar. So thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.